Most people have never heard of this pipeline. But right now, in March 2026, it might be the single most important piece of energy infrastructure on Earth. And here's the thing that makes it wild. Saudi Arabia built it 45 years ago, not because anyone told them to, not because the world was asking for it, but because they saw a threat coming and they quietly built their way out of it. Today, we're going to go deep on the East-West crude oil pipeline. What it is, what it cost, how it was actually built, and why right now, in 2026, it is the only thing standing between the global economy and a full energy collapse. Let's start with some context. Because to understand why this pipeline matters so much, you have to understand what just happened. On March 2nd, 2026, Iran formally blockaded the Strait of Hormuz. This came after a US-Israel military campaign in the region. Almost overnight, one of the most critical shipping lanes on Earth closed to non-Iranian vessels. Now, if you don't know what the Strait of Hormuz is, here's the short version. It is a narrow strip of water, about 33 kilometers wide, at its narrowest point. It sits between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And before the blockade, approximately 20 million barrels of oil passed through it every single day. That is about 20% of the entire world's petroleum supply moving through one bottleneck. When Iran shut it, the market went into shock. Gulf tanker traffic collapsed from nearly 20 million barrels a day to essentially zero. Oil prices started climbing fast, pushing toward and past $100 a barrel. And then, almost immediately, everyone started asking the same question. What's the backup plan? Saudi Arabia already had one. Now, before we get into the pipeline itself, let me give you a moment that perfectly captures this story. On March 10th, 2026, Saudi Aramco CEO Amin Nasser got on an earnings call with investors. And in the middle of discussing the biggest oil market disruption in modern history, he said almost calmly, "We built it with this in mind for contingency." He was talking about the Petroline, the East-West crude oil pipeline, a 1,200-kilometer piece of infrastructure that Saudi Arabia built in 1981. Let that sink in. They built it in 1981 for this exact situation. And 45 years later, the situation arrived. So let's talk about the pipeline itself. And let's get into the real details because this is where it gets genuinely impressive. The decision to build the Petroline was made in 1979. King Khalid authorized the project. At the time, the Iranian Revolution had just happened. The Shah was gone, the Ayatollah was in power, and the Iran-Iraq War was about to begin. Saudi leadership looked at the map and saw something terrifying. Nearly all of their oil exports traveled through the Strait of Hormuz. If that waterway got blocked, Saudi Arabia's entire economy would stop. So they commissioned a pipeline, and not a small one. The East-West pipeline runs 1,201 kilometers across the Arabian Peninsula. It starts at the Abqaiq oil processing complex in the eastern province, near the Persian Gulf coast. And it goes all the way to the Red Sea port of Yanbu on the other side of the country. The terrain it crosses is brutal. The pipeline starts on flat eastern desert, crosses the Dana Sand Sea, climbs the Hejaz mountain range, and then descends to the coastal plain at Yanbu. Building this in 1981 was a serious engineering undertaking. The pipeline is actually two parallel pipes. One is 56 inches in diameter, the other is 48 inches in diameter. To put that in perspective, 56 inches is almost 5 feet across. These are massive steel arteries buried under the Saudi desert. The original pipeline was built and operated by Petromin, which was the state petroleum organization before Aramco's full nationalization. It took 2 years to complete from authorization to first oil flow. Construction finished in 1981. And here is the number that really tells you something. It cost approximately $2.5 billion to build in 1981 dollars. Adjust that for inflation to 2026, and you are looking at roughly $8.5 billion. And remember, that was for an insurance policy, a backup plan, something they hoped they would never need. For context on what $2.5 billion in 1981 meant, Saudi Arabia was basically betting a massive portion of its discretionary capital on a scenario that seemed theoretical at the time. That is a remarkable act of national planning. Most countries don't think that way. Most governments fund what they need right now, not what they might need in 40 years. Now let's talk about capacity because there's an interesting evolution here. The Petroline opened in 1981 with an initial capacity of 1.85 million barrels per day. After the Gulf War exposed the vulnerability of the Hormuz Strait, Saudi Arabia upgraded the system. By 1992, it was running at 5 million barrels per day. On the 14th of September 2019, Houthi drones struck Saudi Aramco's Abqaiq processing facility. This historic disruption knocked out 5.7 million barrels per day of processing capacity overnight, causing global oil prices to spike 15% the following Monday. Aramco quickly activated the East-West pipeline to reroute crude to Yanbu. By temporarily converting parallel natural gas liquids, not going to lie, pipelines to carry crude oil, they boosted the Petroleum system's emergency capacity to 7 million barrels per day, restoring full production within 2 weeks. That 7 million barrel capacity was only sustained for a few days before Abqaiq came back online and the not going to lie lines reverted to natural gas. However, the 2019 crisis served as an unplanned dry run, an experience that proved enormously important in 2026. So when the Hormuz blockade hit in 2026, Aramco had a playbook, and they executed it fast. In the first 9 days of March, tanker tracking data showed Yanbu exports more than doubled from February levels. By March 11th, Aramco completed the full conversion. The pipeline was flowing at 7 million barrels per day for the first time in its 45-year history. One tanker data firm called Windward reported a 330% surge in exports from Yanbu compared to pre-war levels. 27 very large crude carriers were lined up at anchor, waiting to load. 37 tankers were expected to load at Yanbu during March 2026. In a normal month, that number is around 12. This was the infrastructure moment that the original engineers in 1979 had imagined. And by the way, if you want to follow more content like this, hit subscribe to Next Build right now. We break down the real infrastructure and geopolitical moves that shape the world. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The system begins at Abqaiq, the world's largest crude oil processing and stabilization plant, boasting a capacity of 7 million barrels per day. It receives raw crude from massive sources: Ghawar, the largest conventional field; Safaniya, the largest offshore field; and Sheba, located in the empty quarter. Raw crude cannot be pumped directly into the pipeline. Before entering the Petroleum, the oil must be stabilized at Abqaiq, a critical step where volatile gases are stripped away to make the crude safe for transport and tanker loading. The stabilized oil travels west through 2 parallel lines spanning 1,200 kilometers. A series of major pumping stations maintains pressure along the route, providing the immense power required to push heavy crude over the Hejaz mountain range. The pipeline journey ends at the western terminal of Yanbu. However, the arrival of the oil at this location introduces a complicated and critical constraint that is rarely discussed. Even though the pipeline can transport 7 million barrels per day, the Yanbu terminals cannot load that volume onto tankers. Yanbu North offers a loading capacity of 1.5 million barrels per day, while Yanbu South, added in 2018, handles 3 million. Combined, their nominal capacity maxes out at roughly 4.5 million barrels per day. Actual operational limits are even lower. Argus Media notes an effective ceiling of 4 million barrels per day, and Vortexa estimates this drops to 3 million barrels per day under current wartime conditions. Additionally, about 2 million barrels per day never leaves the country, as it is diverted to feed refineries on Saudi Arabia's western coast. Consequently, the real net export through the Red Sea is only about 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day. Compared to the 5.5 million barrels per day previously exported through Ras Tanura before the war, it's clear the Petroleum acts as a temporary pressure valve to buy time, rather than a complete replacement. What makes this system remarkable is Aramco's pre-war strategy. Before the conflict, they deliberately ran the pipeline at just 3.2 million barrels per day. By holding their surge capacity in reserve for this exact type of emergency, the company demonstrated exceptional foresight and operational discipline. Let's also talk about the world context here, because Saudi Arabia is not the only country with bypass infrastructure, but it has by far the best. The UAE has the Abu Dhabi Crude Oil Pipeline, also known as ADCOP. That pipeline runs about 400 kilometers from Abu Dhabi's oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. It has a capacity of about 1.5 million barrels per day. Good infrastructure, but nowhere near the scale of the Petroleum. Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar have no equivalent bypass. Their oil has nowhere to go except through the Strait of Hormuz. With the blockade in place, their exports have largely ground to a halt. The IEA estimated the global supply shortfall from the Hormuz closure at 10 to 12 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia's Petroline, even running at maximum realistic export capacity of around 2.5 million barrels per day, addresses maybe 20 to 25% of that gap. To help cover the rest, the IEA coordinated a record release of 400 million barrels from member state strategic petroleum reserves in early March. At the pace of the shortfall, analysts calculated that reserve release gives the world roughly 33 to 40 days of cover. That is how serious this situation is. Now, let's take a step back and think about what this means for the future of energy infrastructure globally. For 40 years, the conventional wisdom was that any Hormuz closure would be temporary. Iran needed the Strait open to export its own oil. No rational actor would close it permanently. So you didn't need full bypass capacity. You just needed enough to handle a short disruption. That calculation assumed two things. One, that Iran would always have a self-interest in keeping Hormuz open. And two, that Iran's military capabilities were limited enough that disruption would be short and reversible. Both of those assumptions have now been invalidated simultaneously. What we're learning from March 2026 is that the infrastructure bet made in the 1980s and 1990s was too conservative. Engineers knew they could build more bypass capacity. A 1997 Baker Institute study estimated that the Petroline could be expanded to 11 million barrels per day for $600 million. That upgrade was never made because the risk was never considered high enough to justify it. That decision looks different today. Every major oil-producing nation and every energy-dependent consumer nation is watching what is happening right now and asking the same question. What do we need to build so we are never in this position? That question is going to drive hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure investment over the next decade. New pipelines, new terminals, new storage capacity, new diversification of supply routes. And at the center of all of it is this one pipeline in the Saudi desert that an 80-year-old king authorized in 1979 and that a team of engineers built across brutal terrain in 2 years for $2.5 billion. Let's zoom back out to the big picture. The Petroline is now moving more oil than at any point in its 45-year history. It is simultaneously Saudi Arabia's economic lifeline and a lesson in what long-term infrastructure thinking actually looks like. $2.5 billion in 1981, $8.5 billion in today's money, for a backup route that sat mostly idle for 4 decades. That investment is now earning back its cost in probably a matter of weeks. At 2 to 2.5 million barrels a day of net exports, at current elevated oil prices above $100 a barrel, Saudi Arabia is generating $200 to $250 million a day in export revenue that would otherwise be zero. The pipeline paid for itself in about 40 days of operation. That is the return on infrastructure investment. That is what it means to build something for the worst-case scenario instead of the expected case. And think about what the alternative would have looked like. If Saudi Arabia had not built this pipeline, the 2026 Hormuz blockade would have completely zeroed out Saudi oil exports. The global energy shock would be worse by orders of magnitude. The economic consequences would be felt for years. One piece of infrastructure, built 45 years ago, changes the entire math. If you want to understand how the world actually works, pay attention to the infrastructure that nobody talks about until it becomes the most important thing on Earth. That is the lesson of the Petroline. It was not the loudest move. It was not the flashiest announcement. It was just a pipeline in the desert that someone decided to build when the threat was still theoretical. That is what real strategic planning looks like, not reacting to crises. Building the solution before the crisis arrives. Subscribe to Next Build if you want more of this kind of breakdown. Drop a comment below. What do you think happens next? Does the Strait of Hormuz reopen? Does Saudi Arabia expand Yanbu? I want to hear your take. See you in the next one.